The morning sun cast long shadows across the crystal towers of the Galactic Military Academy as Professor Velthar walked into his classroom. His blue skin shimmered slightly under the artificial lighting, and his forearms moved with practiced ease as he arranged his teaching materials. Today would be different from his usual lectures about alien psychology and military tactics. Today he would introduce his students to something that had been keeping the Galactic Council awake at night for months. 12 cadets sat in the curved amphitheater, each representing a different species from across the known galaxy. They chatted quietly among themselves, their various forms of communication creating a soft buzz of clicks, whistles, and telepathic hums that filled the room with an almost musical quality. Yun Wu sat in the front row, his crystalline body reflecting the light in sharp angles. His species, the Veltar, had built their entire civilization on logic and mathematical precision. Every decision they made was calculated, every action predetermined by careful analysis. War, for them, was simply a matter of resource allocation and strategic positioning. Nothing more, nothing less. Behind him, So Young shifted uncomfortably, in her water-filled mobility suit. Her aquatic species had evolved in the peaceful depths of their ocean world, where conflict was resolved through emotional harmony and collective understanding. The very concept of organized violence was foreign to her people, though they understood it existed among other species. Dongmin occupied a specially designed station that could interface directly with his silicon-based neural networks. His people processed information at incredible speeds, turning complex tactical situations into simple mathematical equations. They had solved their own planetary conflicts centuries ago through pure computational analysis, finding optimal solutions that satisfied all parties involved. Ye Jin sat with perfect posture, her scaled skin bearing the ritual scars of her warrior culture. The Kalari had a proud military tradition, but their conflicts followed strict codes of honor. Battles were formal affairs with clear rules, proper ceremony, and respect for fallen enemies. Victory was important, but how one achieved victory mattered even more. In the back corner, Tai Hyun tried to make his massive frame fit into a standard seat. His species, the gentle Mordai, stood nearly 3 meters tall, but had never developed weapons more sophisticated than farming tools. They had achieved interstellar travel through pure scientific curiosity, never having experienced the technological acceleration that warfare typically brought to developing civilizations. Da-Yun sat perfectly still, her large compound eyes processing information from multiple angles simultaneously. As a representative of the hive-minded Zefti, she found individual thinking challenging but fascinating. Her people made decisions collectively, with thousands of minds contributing to every choice. The concept of a single being making life-or-death decisions seemed both terrifying and impossibly crude. Professor Velthar cleared his throat, a sound that resonated through multiple vocal chambers. Today we begin your final project for this course. You will be studying the military psychology and tactical methods of a recently contacted species. The cadets straightened with interest. New species were always exciting to study, offering fresh perspectives on how different evolutionary paths could lead to various approaches to conflict and cooperation. The species is called humans, Velthar continued, activating his holographic display. They originate from a small planet in what they call the Sol system. Initial contact protocols have classified them as a Class 7 civilization with basic space technology and standard social structures. Hyun Woo's crystalline features shifted into what passed for a smile among his people. Class 7 species were typically straightforward to analyze. Their military strategies usually followed predictable patterns based on resource scarcity and territorial disputes. Your task will be to review archived footage of their military conflicts and provide a comprehensive psychological profile of their approach to warfare. This analysis will help the Council determine appropriate first contact procedures. So Young raised one of her tentacle-like appendages. Professor, what makes this species particularly interesting for study? Velthar paused for a moment, his expression unreadable. The preliminary reports describe them as resourceful but unremarkable. However, there are some inconsistencies in their behavioral patterns that warrant closer examination. Dongmin's optical sensors flickered as he processed this information. Inconsistencies typically indicate incomplete data sets or observation errors. Should we expect standard deviation ranges in their tactical approaches? That, Velthar said slowly, is what you will determine. The professor distributed data, tablets to each student, the devices automatically adjusting to accommodate different sensory organs and manipulation appendages. You will find extensive archives of human military footage spanning approximately 12,000 years of their recorded history. Start with what appear to be their more recent conflicts and work backward through their timeline. Ye Jin examined her tablet with professional interest. 12,000 years was a substantial military history for any species. Her own people had detailed records going back only half that time, and they considered themselves quite advanced in military scholarship. The analysis should focus on tactical decision-making, psychological motivations, and strategic objectives, Velthar continued. Pay particular attention to how they handled disadvantageous situations, their approach to casualties, and their methods of unit cohesion. Taehyun shifted nervously in his seat. Even discussing military tactics made him uncomfortable, but academic requirements were academic requirements. He hoped human conflicts would at least be more civilized than some of the barbaric practices he had studied from other warrior species. You have 3 standard weeks to complete your research. Your final presentations will be given to a panel that includes council representatives, so please ensure your work meets the highest academic standards. The cadets began examining their tablets, scrolling through indices of human military footage. The archives were impressively comprehensive, with detailed metadata and contextual information for each recording. Hyun Woo noted with approval that the files were well organized and properly categorized. Everything seemed quite standard for a Class 7 species analysis. He selected a file labeled Recent Tactical Engagement, Desert Operations, and prepared to begin his systematic review. So Young chose something that seemed less violent based on its title, Medical Corps Operations, Battlefield Treatment Protocols. She hoped studying their healing practices might be less disturbing than watching actual combat. Dongmin immediately gravitated toward files with extensive tactical data. Large-scale strategic operations, multi-theater coordination. His computational mind was eager to analyze their logistical capabilities and resource management systems. Ye Jin selected Elite Unit Training and Performance Standards, expecting to find information about human warrior cultures and their codes of conduct. Every warrior species had such traditions, and studying them was always enlightening. Taehyun carefully chose what appeared to be the most benign option available: historical conflicts, ancient tactical methods. Surely studying their primitive past would be less troubling than examining modern warfare. Da-Yun picked small unit tactics and individual decision-making, curious about how beings who lacked collective consciousness could coordinate effectively in high-stress situations. As the students began their preliminary research, Professor Velthar watched them with an expression that might have been concern, or perhaps anticipation. He had taught this course for over 2 centuries, introducing thousands of cadets to dozens of different species and their approaches to conflict. None of those previous studies had prepared him for what these students were about to discover. The Terran archives contained footage that had been carefully collected by long-range observation probes over several decades. Every major human conflict had been recorded and analyzed by Council xenopsychologists, creating the most comprehensive study of any species' military behavior in galactic history. It was also the most disturbing. But Velthar knew that his students needed to see this for themselves. Academic theory could only go so far in preparing future military leaders for the realities they might face among the stars. Sometimes the best education came from having one's assumptions completely shattered. The cadets worked quietly, occasionally making notes or adjusting their viewing parameters. The soft sounds of their various species' concentration habits filled the room. Hyunwoo's gentle crystalline chiming, So Young's rhythmic water circulation, Dongmin's electronic humming, none of them suspected that by the end of their research period, half of them would formally request psychological counseling. None of them imagined that their understanding of warfare, honor, and the very nature of sentient behavior was about to be fundamentally challenged. None of them were prepared for humanity. The first viewing session began 3 days later in the Academy's Advanced Analysis Laboratory. Each cadet had their own private booth equipped with holographic displays and biometric monitoring systems that would track their psychological responses to the material they studied. Professor Velthar moved between the booths, checking on his students' progress and offering guidance when needed. Hyunwoo activated his first file with characteristic, methodical precision. The footage showed what appeared to be a narrow mountain pass where a small group of human warriors faced an enormous army. The metadata indicated this was called the Battle of Thermopylae, fought approximately 2,500 years ago according to human dating systems. He expected to see a standard tactical withdrawal when faced with overwhelming odds. Instead, he watched 300 humans choose to fight to the death against an army of over 100,000 enemies. His crystalline neural pathways struggled to process what he was seeing. The logical response to such overwhelming odds was immediate surrender or tactical retreat to preserve fighting strength for a more favorable engagement. These concepts were so fundamental to military thinking that they formed the basis of strategic planning across dozens of species. But the humans stayed and fought. Hyunwoo replayed the footage multiple times, his optical sensors analyzing every detail. The humans knew they would die. Their leaders had told them explicitly that none would return home. There was no strategic value to their position that justified such losses. No vital resources to protect, no time needed for evacuations, no technological advantage to be gained. They fought simply because they had decided to fight. His logic centers began generating error messages as they tried to reconcile this behavior with known patterns of military psychology. Every calculation he ran indicated that the human response was not just suboptimal, but completely irrational. Yet somehow this irrational last stand had become legendary among humans, inspiring them for thousands of years afterward. In the next booth, So Young was having her own crisis of understanding. She had started with footage labeled as medical operations, expecting to study how humans treated their wounded. What she found instead was something that challenged every concept her empathic species had about self-preservation. The hologram showed human medics running directly into active combat zones to retrieve wounded soldiers. Artillery shells exploded around them as they dragged injured comrades to safety. Snipers targeted them specifically, and they knew it, yet they continued their work. Her species' empathic abilities allowed her to feel the emotions radiating from the recorded humans. What she sensed made no sense. These medics were terrified, absolutely convinced they were going to die, yet they kept running toward danger instead of away from it. The emotional contradiction was overwhelming. Fear and determination, terror and compassion, self-preservation and self-sacrifice all existed simultaneously in the same beings. Her empathic processing centers, evolved to read the simple emotional states of peaceful aquatic creatures, began to overload from the intensity and complexity of human feelings. She watched a human medic named Kim work for 18 straight hours in a field hospital while enemy shells fell around him. When shrapnel wounded him, he treated his own injuries and continued working. When the hospital was directly targeted, he helped evacuate patients before treating his own worsening wounds. So Young's tentacles began trembling uncontrollably. Her species would never risk one life to save another when the risk was this high. The mathematical calculation was simple. Losing 2 lives to save 1 was always a net negative outcome. But humans seemed to operate by different mathematics entirely. Dongmin was deep into analysis of the D-Day landings from their Second World War. His computational mind was processing the tactical data with growing confusion. According to his calculations, the human plan had a projected casualty rate of over 30%, with some units expected to sustain losses exceeding 70%. Any rational military command structure would have canceled such an operation, or sought alternative approaches with better success to casualty ratios. His people had fought their own planetary wars using precise calculations that never accepted casualty rates above 5% for any single engagement. But the humans had launched their assault anyway. 9,000 humans died in a single day, with over 30,000 wounded, and their leadership considered this an acceptable outcome. More disturbing still, the individual soldiers had known the casualty projections and participated willingly. Dongmin's processors began running recursive loops as they tried to understand the decision matrix that could lead to such choices. Every simulation he ran indicated that the humans should have sought a diplomatic solution, developed better technology, or simply accepted a prolonged stalemate rather than accepting such massive losses. His analysis subroutines kept returning. The same result: the human approach was statistically insane, yet it had worked. Ye Jin was studying what she initially thought would be familiar territory: warrior cultures and their combat traditions. She had selected footage of human berserkers and Viking warriors, expecting to find concepts similar to her own people's military honor codes. What she found instead made her question everything she thought she knew about being a warrior. The footage showed humans entering battle states that could only be described as controlled madness. These warriors fought with an intensity that went beyond anything in her species' most sacred combat traditions. They seemed to become something other than rational beings, transforming into forces of pure violence and determination. Her people fought with skill, honor, and careful attention to proper form. Combat was an art, a test of training and character. Victory was glorious, but the manner of victory mattered as much as the outcome itself. Human warriors appeared to care nothing for form or art. They fought like natural disasters given human shape, destroying everything in their path with a ferocity that made her own warrior culture seem like a children's game. She watched recordings of humans fighting with mortal wounds that should have incapacitated them, continuing to battle even as they died. She saw warriors who fought on after losing limbs, who used their own blood to blind enemies, who turned their dying breath into one final attack. The most disturbing part was that this was not considered exceptional behavior among humans. It was simply what warriors did. In the corner booth, Tae-hyun was discovering that there was no such thing as gentle human warfare. He had specifically chosen historical conflicts from humanity's distant past, hoping that primitive weapons and ancient tactics would be less traumatic to study than modern military operations. Instead, he found that human brutality transcended technological advancement. The footage showed siege warfare from their medieval period, where humans would starve entire cities for months or years rather than accept partial victory. He watched recordings of humans using catapults to launch diseased corpses over city walls, spreading plague among defenders. He saw battles where humans fought with crude weapons until rivers literally ran red with blood. His massive frame shook as he watched humans burn entire forests to deny them to enemies, salt agricultural fields to prevent future cultivation, and demolish their own cities rather than let them fall into enemy hands. These were supposedly primitive humans, yet their capacity for sustained, organized violence exceeded anything his peaceful species could imagine. The fact that they had only grown more efficient at warfare as their technology advanced was a thought too horrible to fully process. Da-Un was struggling with a different kind of incomprehension. Her hive-minded species made all decisions through collective processing, with thousands of individuals contributing their thoughts to reach optimal solutions. The concept of individual decision-making was foreign enough under normal circumstances. Watching humans make split-second tactical decisions in combat situations was breaking her understanding of how conscious beings could function. The footage showed small human units operating independently for weeks or months, with individual soldiers making choices that affected entire operations. There was no collective guidance, no shared consciousness to ensure optimal outcomes, yet somehow these isolated humans coordinated with devastating effectiveness. She watched a human special forces team infiltrate enemy territory with each member, making hundreds of independent decisions based on incomplete information. Any one wrong choice could compromise the entire mission, yet they succeeded through what appeared to be pure individual intuition. Her compound eyes tracked multiple data, streamed simultaneously as she tried to understand how beings without shared consciousness could trust each other with such critical decisions. The mathematical probability of success for such operations should have been negligible. Yet human military history was filled with successful missions that defied every principle of collective decision-making. By the end of the first week, all 6 cadets were showing signs of psychological stress. Their normal sleep cycles were disrupted, their academic performance in other courses was declining, and several had requested additional time to process what they were learning. Professor Velthar watched their deteriorating condition with a mixture of sympathy and professional interest. Despite their growing concerns, the cadets found themselves unable to stop their research. What had started as academic curiosity had become something closer to horrified fascination. Each new piece of footage they analyzed revealed behaviors that seemed to violate the basic laws of how intelligent species should function. Hyun Woo had developed what his species called logic cascade failure, a condition where their crystalline neural networks became overwhelmed by irreconcilable data patterns. He had moved beyond studying individual battles to examining what humans called last stands throughout their history. Each example further eroded his understanding of rational military behavior. The Battle of Masada showed him nearly 1,000 humans choosing mass suicide rather than surrender to Roman forces. The tactical situation offered clear alternatives: negotiation, conditional surrender, or even escape through terrain the Romans had not fully secured. Instead, the humans killed themselves and their families rather than accept defeat. His logic centers generated cascading error messages as they tried to process this behavior. Self-termination to avoid capture made no sense from any strategic perspective. Living beings could potentially escape, negotiate better terms, or fight again another day. Dead beings offered no further possibilities. Yet the humans had chosen death, and their civilization remembered this choice as heroic rather than tragic. The Alamo provided another example that broke his analytical frameworks. A small group of humans had fortified an indefensible position and fought to the death against overwhelming odds. Unlike Thermopylae, where the terrain provided some tactical advantage, the Alamo offered no strategic benefit whatsoever. The humans could have retreated, regrouped, and fought more effectively elsewhere. Instead, they stayed and died, accomplishing nothing except creating what they called a symbol of resistance. Hyun-Woo's crystalline structure began developing stress fractures as his mind tried to comprehend how symbols could be worth more than lives to a rational species. Rourke's drift showed him fewer than 150 humans successfully defending against over 4,000 attackers. The logical response to such odds was immediate withdrawal, yet these humans had not only stayed, but had actually won the engagement. His computational systems could not reconcile the mathematical impossibility of their victory with the documented historical outcome. According to every tactical algorithm his species had developed, the battle should have resulted in complete human annihilation within the first hour. Instead, the humans had fought for 12 continuous hours and emerged victorious. So Young had expanded her research into human military medicine, hoping to find some rational aspect of their warfare that her empathic mind could understand. What she discovered instead was a level of dedication to preserving life that coexisted impossibly with an equal dedication to taking it. She studied the work of human field surgeons who operated continuously for days without rest while artillery bombardments shook their surgical tables. These doctors made life-or-death decisions under conditions that would paralyze her own species' medical professionals with terror. The emotional readings she detected from the archived footage were unlike anything in her species' psychological databases. These humans experienced fear, exhaustion, and despair at levels that should have induced complete mental breakdown, yet they continued functioning at peak performance. She watched footage of a human medic named Min Ho working in what their records called the Korean War. For 36 hours straight, he treated wounded soldiers while enemy forces surrounded their position. When ammunition ran low, he armed himself and fought between medical procedures. When medical supplies were exhausted, he used improvised materials and continued operating. The emotional contradictions were devastating to her empathic senses. This human simultaneously loved life so much that he would risk everything to save others, yet was prepared to take life without hesitation when necessary. The same hands that performed delicate surgery also killed enemy soldiers with clinical efficiency. Her species' understanding of empathy was built on emotional consistency and harmony. These humans displayed emotional ranges that spanned from infinite compassion to absolute ruthlessness, often within the same individual during the same engagement. The most disturbing discovery was that this was not considered unusual behavior among human medical personnel. Their military history was filled with doctors and medics who displayed similar psychological profiles. Dong Min had progressed to analyzing human strategic planning and resource allocation. His computational mind was designed to optimize efficiency and minimize waste in all systems. What he found in human military planning violated every principle of rational resource management. The humans regularly planned operations with casualty projections in the millions, then executed these plans anyway. Their Second World War had resulted in over 70 million deaths, yet they considered this a successful outcome because they had achieved their strategic objectives. His processors struggled to understand a species that would accept such losses for any conceivable goal. His own people had fought their planetary wars with total casualties, numbering in the thousands, and those conflicts were remembered as catastrophic tragedies that nearly destroyed their civilization. But humans treated much larger losses as acceptable costs of doing business. He studied their strategic bombing campaigns, where they deliberately targeted civilian populations to break enemy morale. The mathematical calculations were precise. Kill enough non-combatants, and the enemy would surrender to prevent further losses. This approach violated every principle of efficient warfare his species had developed. Targeting military assets was logical and effective. Targeting civilians was wasteful and counterproductive, typically strengthening enemy resolve rather than weakening it. Yet human strategic bombing had often worked, forcing enemy surrenders through the deliberate application of terror against innocent populations. His analysis routines began generating critical errors as they tried to process a species that could be simultaneously precise in their tactical calculations and completely amoral in their strategic implementations. Ye Jin had moved beyond studying individual warrior cultures to examining what humans called total war, a concept that challenged every notion of honorable combat her species had developed over millennia. Her people fought according to strict codes that preserved civilian populations, protected cultural sites, and maintained basic dignity even during conflict. War was a contest between warriors, not a struggle for complete annihilation. Human total war recognized no such limitations. She studied their scorched earth tactics, where retreating armies destroyed everything that might be useful to advancing. Enemies, farms, cities, infrastructure, and even natural resources were eliminated to deny them to opponents. The strategic logic was sound, but the ethical implications were staggering. These humans would rather destroy their own civilization than allow enemies to benefit from it. She watched footage from their Eastern Front during the Second World War, where both sides implemented scorched earth policies that left entire regions uninhabitable. Cities with populations in the millions were reduced to rubble as a matter of tactical routine. Her warrior culture prized courage, skill, and honor in individual combat. Human warfare appeared to prize effectiveness above all other considerations. If burning a city would advance strategic objectives, they burned it. If starving a population would force enemy surrender, they implemented starvation as a weapon. The most disturbing aspect was that both sides in human conflicts typically employed these methods. It was not a matter of one group being unusually brutal. It appeared to be how humans naturally conducted serious warfare. Her scales had shifted to colors that indicated severe psychological distress as she realized that her species, most fearsome warriors, would be considered gentle by human standards. Tae-hyun had attempted to find examples of peaceful conflict resolution in human history, hoping to discover that their species was capable of alternatives to violence. What he found instead was that humans had weaponized even their diplomatic processes. He studied what they called gunboat diplomacy, where nations conducted negotiations while explicitly threatening military action against non-compliant parties. Treaties were signed under threat of bombardment, trade agreements were enforced through naval blockades, and diplomatic immunity was ignored when convenient. Even their peace negotiations involved implicit or explicit violence. The strongest military powers dictated terms to the weaker ones, with the understanding that non-compliance would result in renewed warfare. His peaceful mind could not comprehend a species that viewed violence as a normal component of diplomatic relations. His people had achieved interstellar civilization through pure scientific cooperation, resolving disputes through rational discussion and mutual compromise. Humans apparently resolved disputes through superior firepower and strategic intimidation. He discovered that humans had developed the concept of peace through strength, which meant maintaining military forces so powerful that potential enemies would not dare challenge them. This was considered a peaceful policy by human standards. His species pursued peace through mutual understanding and shared benefits. The third week of research brought the remaining cadets to their absolute psychological limits. What had begun as academic analysis had become a descent into concepts so alien to their understanding that several species' medical professionals were consulting each other about treatment protocols for conditions they had never encountered. Hyun-woo had moved into studying human nuclear warfare doctrine, and the revelations were systematically dismantling every logical framework his crystalline mind had ever constructed. His species resolved conflicts through mathematical optimization and resource allocation agreements. The concept of weapons designed specifically to eliminate entire civilizations was beyond their comprehension. He analyzed human strategies called mutually assured destruction and discovered that these beings had intentionally created weapons, capable of ending all life on their planet, then built their entire defensive strategy around the threat of using them. The logical paradox was overwhelming. They would destroy themselves to prevent others from destroying them. His neural pathways began experiencing cascading failures as he tried to process the mathematical impossibility of a successful nuclear exchange. Every calculation indicated that the weapons would eliminate both attackers and defenders, making victory meaningless in any rational sense. Yet humans had built tens of thousands of these weapons and pointed them at each other for decades, maintaining what they called peace through the constant threat of mutual annihilation. The most disturbing discovery was their dead man switch protocols, systems designed to automatically launch nuclear weapons if the command structure was eliminated. These humans had literally programmed their weapons to ensure global destruction, even if they were all killed in a surprise attack. His crystalline structure was now showing visible stress fractures as his logic centers tried to reconcile the concept of a species that would rather eliminate all life than accept defeat. The mathematics simply did not work. Dead beings could not benefit from victory, making the strategy completely irrational from any conceivable perspective. Yet the strategy had worked for their entire nuclear age, preventing large-scale conflicts through the credible threat of species-wide suicide. So Young had expanded her research into human peacekeeping operations, hoping to find evidence that their species was capable of constructive rather than destructive approaches to conflict resolution. What she discovered instead shattered her remaining faith in rational behavior patterns. She studied human peacekeeping missions and found that they involved sending armed soldiers into conflict zones with authorization to use lethal force to maintain order. The concept of maintaining peace through violence was so fundamentally contradictory that her empathic processing centers began generating error cascades. Her species maintained harmony through emotional synchronization and mutual understanding. Conflicts were resolved by helping all parties achieve emotional equilibrium and find mutually beneficial solutions. Humans apparently maintained peace by threatening to kill anyone who disrupted it. She watched footage of human peacekeepers in various global conflicts, observing beings who simultaneously expressed genuine desire to help civilian populations while remaining fully prepared to eliminate anyone who threatened their mission objectives. The emotional readings were incomprehensible. Compassion and ruthlessness, mercy and violence, love and hatred, all coexisting within the same individuals during the same operations. She studied a human peacekeeper named Jay Wan, who spent his days distributing food to refugee children and his nights conducting raids against armed groups who threatened the refugee camps. The same hands that gently fed hungry children also killed enemy combatants with professional efficiency. Her empathic abilities, evolved to detect simple emotional states in peaceful aquatic environments, were being overwhelmed by the complexity and intensity of human emotional ranges. These beings operated across emotional spectrums that her species had never evolved to comprehend. The most disturbing aspect was that this emotional complexity appeared to be normal for humans. They seemed to experience contradictory feelings, simultaneously without the psychological breakdown that such conflicts would cause in her species. Dongmin had progressed to analyzing human strategic planning capabilities and resource allocation systems. His computational mind was designed to optimize efficiency in all systems, making human approaches to military logistics a source of constant bewilderment. He studied their approaches to acceptable losses and discovered that humans regularly planned operations with casualty projections that would be considered catastrophic failures by any rational civilization. Their military leadership would approve missions with expected death rates of 30, 40, or even 50% of participating forces. His processors struggled to understand decision matrices that could accommodate such massive waste of resources. His species planned military operations with casualty expectations below 2%, and even those were considered unacceptably high unless absolutely necessary for species survival. But humans seemed to view massive casualties as routine costs of achieving strategic objectives. He analyzed their Vietnam War and discovered that they had sustained over 50,000 deaths and spent enormous resources on a conflict they ultimately lost anyway. The mathematical calculation was simple. They had invested massive amounts of personnel and material for negative strategic returns. Any rational species would have withdrawn from such an obviously unsuccessful endeavor within months of recognizing its futility. But humans had continued fighting for over a decade, accepting losses that should have caused immediate social collapse while pursuing objectives that became increasingly unattainable. His analysis subroutines began generating critical errors, as they tried to process a species that would sustain such losses for unclear strategic gains. Every optimization protocol he ran indicated that human military planning was fundamentally flawed. Yet somehow their civilization had not only survived these massive inefficiencies, but had actually grown stronger through them. Yejin had moved into studying human concepts of crimes against humanity and war crimes, expecting to find evidence that their species maintained some ethical boundaries even during extreme conflicts. What she discovered instead was that humans had developed elaborate legal frameworks specifically because their natural approach to warfare recognized no limits whatsoever. Her warrior culture operated according to honor codes that were instinctive and universal among her people. Combat had natural boundaries that all rational beings respected, protecting non-combatants, treating prisoners with dignity, and avoiding unnecessary cruelty. Humans apparently required written laws and international treaties to prevent themselves from committing acts that her people would never consider in the first place. She studied their Geneva Conventions and discovered detailed legal prohibitions against behaviors that revealed the depths of human capacity for systematic cruelty. The laws themselves were evidence of what humans were capable of doing to each other when not legally restrained. The concept of needing laws to prevent the torture of prisoners was incomprehensible to her species. Such behavior was so fundamentally dishonorable that it would never occur to any rational warrior. Yet humans had engaged in such practices so frequently that they required international legal frameworks to prevent them. She analyzed their enhanced interrogation techniques and discovered that humans had developed scientific approaches to extracting information through systematic psychological and physical torture. They had turned cruelty into a precise methodology, with documented procedures and effectiveness measurements. Her scales had shifted to colors indicating severe psychological trauma as she realized that human war crimes were not aberrations committed by damaged individuals, but systematic practices that their military studied and refined as standard operational procedures. The most disturbing revelation was that both sides in human conflicts typically employed these methods. It was not a matter of one group being unusually brutal. It appeared to be how humans naturally conducted warfare when not specifically prevented by legal constraints. Tae-hyun had attempted to find examples of human conflict resolution that did not involve violence or the threat of violence. His research had led him to study what humans called economic warfare and sanctions, hoping to find peaceful alternatives to military action. What he discovered was that humans had weaponized every aspect of their civilization, including their economic and diplomatic systems. He studied economic blockades designed to starve entire populations into submission, trade sanctions that deliberately targeted civilian infrastructure, and financial warfare that could collapse entire national economies without firing a single shot. His peaceful mind could not comprehend a species that could turn food distribution, medical supplies, and basic necessities into weapons of war. His people had never considered the possibility that economic cooperation could be used as a tool for destruction. Humans apparently viewed everything as a potential weapon, including the systems that sustained life for civilian populations. He analyzed their use of starvation as a military tactic and discovered that they regularly targeted agricultural systems, food distribution networks, strat. The silence that followed Professor Velthar's announcement was absolute. The 5 remaining cadets stared at the star map with expressions of horror that transcended species boundaries. The small yellow star that marked humanity's location seemed to pulse with threatening significance. Hyunwoo's already fractured crystalline structure developed new stress lines as his logic centers tried to process the implications. A species with faster-than-light capability meant humanity was no longer contained within their solar system. They could now spread their particular brand of organized violence throughout the galaxy. So Young's tentacles stopped their agitated movement entirely, freezing in position as her empathic mind was overwhelmed by the emotional implications of what they had just learned. Her species had studied human warfare, assuming it was a historical curiosity, something that would remain safely contained on their distant planet. The realization that humans might soon be capable of interstellar conflict was more than her psychological systems could handle. Professor Velthar allowed the silence to continue for several minutes, watching his students grapple with the magnitude of what they had discovered. Finally, he continued with his revelation. Humanity has been known to the Galactic Council for 47 standard years. The species was first contacted by a routine survey mission that was investigating their primitive radio transmissions. The contact team expected to find a typical developing civilization suitable for standard observation protocols. Dongmin's optical sensors flickered as his computational mind began connecting data points. Professor, if humanity has been known for nearly 5 decades, why are we studying them as a recently discovered species? Because, Velthar replied, the initial contact mission never returned. The holographic display shifted to show the wreckage of a Galactic Council survey vessel floating in the void between solar systems. The ship had been torn apart by weapons that left energy signatures unlike anything in the galactic database. Thair. Survey team consisted of peaceful exploration specialists equipped with standard defensive systems appropriate for contact with pre-spaceflight civilizations. They approached Earth using established protocols for first contact with developing species. Yejin's scales shifted to colors that indicated deep dread among her people. What happened to them? We believe they were destroyed by human defensive systems that detected their approach and classified them as hostile. The humans apparently assumed the contact mission was an invasion fleet and responded accordingly. The display showed tactical analysis of the wreckage. The Council vessel had been attacked with nuclear weapons, kinetic impactors, and directed energy systems that demonstrated both impressive technological capability and absolutely ruthless efficiency. The humans had never seen an alien spacecraft before, but they reacted to first contact by immediately attempting to destroy what they perceived as a threat. There was no attempt at communication, no diplomatic overtures, no hesitation about using lethal force against unknown beings. Taehyun's gentle voice was barely audible. They killed the contact team without even trying to determine their intentions. The analysis suggests that humans defaulted to maximum force response based purely on the assumption that unknown visitors represented existential threats. This behavior pattern appears to be consistent with their historical approaches to dealing with unfamiliar situations. Dayun's individual consciousness struggled to process the concept of beings who would attack first and investigate later. Her hive-minded species always gathered complete information before taking any action, especially one as consequential as violence against unknown entities. Since that incident, Velthar continued, the Council has maintained strict observation protocols regarding humanity. We have used long-range monitoring systems to study their development, but all direct contact has been forbidden. The holographic display shifted to show decades of accumulated data about human technological and social development. The files were marked with security classifications that indicated the highest levels of Council concern. Over the past 47 years, humanity has continued to develop along trajectories that confirm our worst fears about their species. They have not grown more peaceful as their technology advanced. Instead, they have become more efficiently violent. Hyunwoo's fractured voice carried notes of disbelief. Professor, are you saying that this entire course was designed to prepare us for eventual contact with a species that the Council considers actively dangerous? This course is part of a comprehensive preparation program for military leaders. who may eventually need to deal with human expansion into galactic space. Your analysis of their warfare capabilities and psychological profiles will be added to a classified database that has been growing for decades. The truth was finally emerging. The cadets had not been studying an academic curiosity, but participating in active threat assessment for a species that the galactic community viewed as fundamentally dangerous. So Young's empathic abilities were completely overwhelmed as she realized that everything they had studied was not historical analysis, but current intelligence gathering. How many other students have gone through this program? Over 3,000 military cadets from 67 different species have completed similar analyses. The conclusions have been remarkably consistent across all participants, regardless of their species' evolutionary background or cultural frameworks. The display showed statistical summaries from decades of similar research projects. Every species that studied humanity reached the same basic conclusions. Humans were psychologically incompatible with galactic civilization and represented a potentially existential threat to peaceful interstellar society. Your reactions to human military psychology have been documented and analyzed as part of ongoing research into how different species might respond to actual contact with humanity. The psychological stress you have experienced is considered valuable data for predicting how entire civilizations might react to human presence. Dongmin's processors were struggling to analyze the implications of using students as research subjects without their knowledge or consent. Professor, we were not informed that we were participating in classified military research. The research requires genuine responses to human behavior patterns. Informed subjects would likely modify their reactions based on expectations, compromising the validity of the psychological data. Yejin's warrior culture valued honesty and direct communication, making the deception particularly disturbing to her. What other deceptions are you maintaining about this research? Professor Velthar paused, his expression suggesting internal conflict about how much additional information to reveal. The final component of your education requires complete honesty about humanity's current status and the Council's response protocols. The holographic display shifted to show current intelligence about human space exploration efforts. The data indicated that humanity had not only achieved faster-than-light travel, but was actively developing the infrastructure necessary for interstellar colonization. Human expansion into galactic space is no longer a theoretical possibility, but an immediate reality. Their first interstellar mission launched 6 standard months ago. Council monitoring stations have detected human vessels approaching 3 separate star systems. The map highlighted the targeted systems, all of which contained established galactic civilizations. The implications were staggering. Humanity was about to make contact with multiple species simultaneously, without any coordination with galactic authorities. The Council faces an unprecedented decision about how to respond to uncontrolled human expansion. Your research, combined with similar studies conducted over the past decades, will inform that decision. Taehyun's massive frame shook as he processed the implications. What options is the Council considering? 3 primary approaches have been proposed. First, immediate diplomatic contact to attempt integration of humanity into galactic society, under strict behavioral controls. Second, active containment of human expansion through coordinated military intervention. Third, preemptive elimination of the human species before they can establish significant interstellar presence. The silence that followed this revelation was profound. Each cadet was grappling with the realization that their academic research had contributed to discussions about potentially committing genocide against an entire species. Da-Eun's individual consciousness finally managed to formulate a coherent response. Professor, what does our research suggest about the viability of these options? Your analysis of human military psychology suggests that diplomatic integration would be extremely difficult. Humans appear to respond to perceived threats with maximum force, making peaceful coexistence challenging. Additionally, their approach to warfare violates most galactic conventions regarding acceptable conduct during conflicts. The display showed comparative analyses of human warfare versus galactic military norms. The differences were stark and consistent across every category of military behavior. Containment appears equally problematic. Human tactical flexibility and psychological resilience suggest they would adapt to any containment strategy and eventually overcome it through technological innovation or strategic patience.